Welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Game Boy, the series devoted to my unwavering affection for Nintendo's chunky gray handheld gaming system. And this episode is all about Mega Man. My introduction to the Mega Man series was in 1989 when I rented Mega Man 2 on the NES. And this single experience was enough to cement Mega Man as my all-time favorite video game series. And I didn't just play the games either, I talked about Mega Man to literally anyone who would listen. I wrote fan fiction, I drew pictures of the characters, I even tried my hand at homemade Mega Man action figures. I talked the talk and walked the walk of a die-hard Mega Man superfan. And yeah, I know it sounds incredibly dorky, but I was also like 11, so hopefully you'll cut me a little slack. However, despite my enthusiasm for Mega Man, the only games from the NES series I actually finished as a kid were Mega Man 2 and 3, and that was because those were the only games from the series I owned. At some point I rented both Mega Man 1 and 4, but I didn't have the skills at the time to finish the games on a 2-day rental. And I didn't experience Mega Man 5 or 6 at all until I was deep into my 20s. Back then I mainly experienced Mega Man on the Game Boy, which was my favorite childhood video game system. However, I did have to wait a while before my two favorite things finally converged. When the Game Boy launched in the second half of 1989, the most recent game in the series was Mega Man 2 on the NES. Mega Man 2 of course went on to be a smash hit, and yet Capcom was uncharacteristically reserved when it came to adapting the series to the Game Boy. Within that first year of the Game Boy's lifespan, many popular NES series would appear in some form or another on Nintendo's handheld. And yet Mega Man himself wouldn't appear until the Game Boy was about 2.5 years old. Of course, in hindsight, we know that Capcom would do what Capcom does, and open the floodgates with a deluge of sequels on both systems. In total, Mega Man would end up with 6 games on the NES and 5 games on the Game Boy, which was more mainline games, with a big emphasis on mainline by the way, than any other franchise would have on either system. Mega Man's portable series would have its fair share of highs and lows over the course of its 5-game run, but it could generally be said that the series got better and better with each entry. And even if Mega Man's portable games never quite reached the quality of the games on the NES, I still think it's fair to say that the series accounted for some of the very best games on the Game Boy. And so with the preamble out of the way, let's get into the good, the bad, and the Mega Man. Mega Man and Dr. Wily's Revenge was developed by Minakuchi Engineering, a company who would continue to work with Capcom on many Mega Man titles. Known as Rockman World in Japan, this game was kind of a side story to the core Mega Man series on the NES. While it mainly focused on the original Mega Man game, it also borrowed many assets and ideas from Mega Man 2. Also, it's worth mentioning that the American box art was pulled directly from Mega Man 3's cover, which showed a very elfish-looking Mega Man shooting Sparkman right in the dick. The method of Dr. Wily's titular revenge is a little half-baked compared to his episodic schemes from the NES games. Instead of crafting 8 new robot masters to challenge Mega Man, Wily resurrects 4 robots from the first game: Cutman, Electman, Iceman, and Fireman. The omission of the iconic Gutsman and my personal favorite Bombman is unfortunate, but it seems like the selection of robots was likely based on the utility of the sub-weapons you get from them. And let's be real, as great as Gutsman and Bombman were, their weapons were honestly among the very worst in the entire series. Wily has also resurrected 4 robots from Mega Man 2, Quickman, Flashman, Heatman, and Bubbleman, although they only appear as boss fights towards the end of the game. And lastly, there's a 9th robot called Anchor, a new boss character unique to the game and acting as kind of a secondary boss before the final showdown with Dr. Wily. It would be easy enough to dismiss Dr. Wily's Revenge as a simple port of Mega Man 1. But all of the stages in the game are entirely original, and there's plenty of unique elements sprinkled throughout the game to give Mega Man's first Game Boy adventure a distinct identity over the NES series. Graphically, the game looks excellent. Character sprites are perfect pixel-to-pixel duplicates of their NES counterparts. The music is also fantastic. The subtly reworked themes from the original game sound great, and there's a handful of truly banging original themes as well. But I think it's time I address the elephant in the room. The elephant in this case, of course, being Mega Man himself. Mega Man is enormous in this game. The Game Boy screen was a little over half the size of the video output of the NES, and by that I don't mean the size as in inches, I mean the number of pixels that were being displayed on the screen. The NES screen was, I think, 256 by 240 pixels, whereas the Game Boy was just 160 by 144. On the NES, character sprites typically fell into the 8 to 10% range in relation to the overall screen size. Some characters were taller and wider than others, but generally they were all about 8% as wide as the game screen and about 10% as tall, give or take. So when developers brought their popular NES titles to the Game Boy, they had to make a choice. Do they sacrifice character detail by shrinking the sprite down to more closely match the console's character-to-screen ratio? Or do they keep the character NES accurate at the expense of valuable real estate on the Game Boy screen? Mega Man went the latter route. His sprite takes up about 13% of the horizontal size of the Game Boy screen and about 17% of the vertical, except even that isn't accurate. There's this big bar at the bottom of the screen that displays all the health and energy gauges, which cuts down the vertical size of the playable game screen by another 16 pixels, pushing that vertical percentage up to nearly 20%. So Mega Man appears approximately twice as tall on the Game Boy screen as he does on the NES. This creates a very cramped environment where there's very little room separating Mega Man from the enemy characters, the stage hazards, and the basic geometry of the stages. They did try to compensate for this a little bit by decreasing the height of his jump and his movement speed. Although, to be fair, the reduced running speed was also to compensate for the notorious motion blur of the Game Boy screen. However, even these concessions create their own problems. Mega Man, as a result of all these changes, feels a lot more sluggish on the Game Boy. And the reduced jump height means that it's now just that much harder to avoid boss characters who are also, I should add, the exact same size as their NES counterparts. Now, I'm spending so much time on this because Dr. Wily's Revenge is generally seen as a very difficult game. And this is why. The challenge comes not from tricky or malicious game design, it's because of how the game actually works. But in spite of all that, Mega Man's first outing on the Game Boy is an excellent game. One of my very favorites, in fact. Its flaws aren't exactly small. It's understandable that they would be deal breakers for a lot of people. But the fact that it received 4 sequels means that enough people were able to overlook these flaws that it remained a lucrative series for Capcom long into the Game Boy's lifespan, and would account for some of the most beloved games in the system's library. Unfortunately, it would get a lot worse before it got better. Just a few months after Dr. Wily's Revenge released in the US, we received its first sequel, and I was really excited about this one. While Dr. Wily's Revenge did borrow some assets from Mega Man 2, it was mainly focused on the original Mega Man game, which at the time I didn't really have much of a connection to. The sequel, however, would take assets from Mega Man 2 and 3, both of which I owned and loved. Now, just like Mega Man 2 did on the NES, Mega Man 2 on the Game Boy would build upon the basic structure of the first game and pretty much establish the format that all future games would follow. Mega Man would first fight through 4 robots from one of the NES games. In this case, it would be Crash Man, Metal Man, Airman, and Woodman from Mega Man 2. After a brief Dr. Wily stage, Mega Man would then face another quartet of bosses from the next game in the NES series, which were, in this game, Needle Man, Magnet Man, Hard Man, and Top Man from Mega Man 3. In the previous game, the second wave of robots only appeared as boss fights, but now they would each appear at the end of a full stage. And as with Dr. Wily's Revenge, a wholly original 9th robot acted as the game's secondary antagonist, which in Mega Man 2 is Quint, a reprogrammed version of Mega Man from the future. And upon defeating him, Mega Man would then enter the final Dr. Wily stage, which took place in a different base than the one that Mega Man visited in the game's halfway point. Now, on paper, it sounded amazing. Not only did it focus on my 2 favorite games from the NES series, it would also address my chief complaint with Dr. Wily's Revenge by giving proper stages to the second wave of boss robots. And then I played the game. So until recently, the cutting room floor, one of my go-to resources for video game information, reported that Mega Man 2 was developed for Capcom by a company called Japan System House. I guess some new information has come to light because now they are crediting a company called Thinking Rabbit, who are responsible for 8 Eyes on the NES and the Sokoban games, which I know as Boxel on the Game Boy. In either case, Mega Man 2 was developed by a smaller studio with very few hits under their belt, and who apparently weren't very familiar with the Mega Man series. And it showed. Possibly in response to the complaints about the first game's difficulty, Mega Man 2 makes a number of adjustments. The most obvious is the weird and ugly miniaturization of all the character sprites. Now on its face, I don't think this is a bad idea. I think this is probably what they should have done in the first place. There's not a lot of room on the Game Boy screen, so smaller characters means more room to work with. That's pretty easy math. Nintendo themselves, with Super Mario Land, set a pretty good example of how a game can be shrunken down to a very comfortable and playable degree and still be immediately recognizable. The issue is that the sprites in Mega Man 2 weren't shrunken down in a very consistent way. Most of the characters had just a few lines of pixels removed, giving them a strange, almost chibi appearance. Mid-boss character sprites are abbreviated even further, which looks even more ridiculous when appearing on screen with the same NES-accurate Mega Man sprite from Dr. Wily's Revenge. When Mega Man himself is the only character who has not been adjusted down to fit the Game Boy screen, it kind of makes it look like he's been pulled into some weird Lilliputian dimension where everything is a fraction its normal size. Take a look at Dr. Wily in the final fight here. Can you see him? He's the pair of eyes that you can barely see peering over the controls of this dinosaur mech. But as ugly and visually inconsistent as these new graphics are, the most important point I can make, and I can't stress this enough, is that for better or worse, this is not how the first game did it, and I don't like it when things are different. And as long as we're on the subject of doing things different, Mega Man 2 does not reuse the music from the original games, as Dr. Wily's Revenge did. It replaces all those classic stage themes from Mega Man 2 and 3 with original music tracks. And while the compositions of these new themes isn't completely terrible, the music itself is ear-piercingly high-pitched and extremely unpleasant to listen to. And even if this wasn't the case, I still don't understand what they were hoping to accomplish here. Did they really think they could come up with better music than what we had in Mega Man 2 and 3, which are, years later, still regarded as some of the best soundtracks in the entire series? And adding to this are the number of other equally odd design choices, like the out-of-place sound effects, or the way levels continue scrolling into the boss hallway. I mean, that's not right, that's not how Mega Man works. They also couldn't figure out how to make the sub-weapons deplete the gauges completely, so you can effectively run out of ammo while still having unused bars in the energy gauge. And even with the shrunken down sprites, the stages still somehow feel more cramped and crowded than they did in Dr. Wily's Revenge. Quint's character design is lame, and his weapon is stupid. I don't even know how to use this thing without taking damage. But you know what, it ultimately doesn't matter, because in spite of all these issues, Mega Man 2 is entirely toothless. And not in a fun, breezy kind of way like Mega Man 6 was, but in a, dear God, I totally wasted my allowance money on this game kind of way. The whole game feels clumsy, and derpy, and amateurish, and extremely, aggressively un-Mega Man-like. So congratulations Capcom and Thinking Rabbit or Japan System House, whoever. Together you created one of the very worst Mega Man games ever made. I hope you're proud of yourselves. Mega Man 3 quietly released in the shadow of a certain other Game Boy game that hogged the spotlight in the holiday season of 1992. Previews for the game seemed to be minimal, and I'm not even entirely sure I knew it had been released at all until gaming magazines published their reviews in January of 1993. Nintendo Power themselves buried the game in the back of their Game Boy section, behind games like Incredible Crash Dummies and Battleship. Mega Man 3 was the 5th Mega Man game that Capcom had published between the holiday seasons of 1991 and 92. It's safe to say that Mega Man fatigue was setting in, and the previous 2 Game Boy entries clearly hadn't convinced gaming publications that the series was worth making a big fuss about. Now, in spite of my disappointment with how Mega Man 2 had turned out, and you can say what you want, but that game was a blight on the entire series, I was all too eager to give Mega Man's Game Boy series another chance. Following the formula established by the first 2 games, Mega Man 3 sets players against the remaining 4 bosses from the NES version of Mega Man 3, Snake Man, Shadow Man, Spark Man, and Gemini Man. After a short Dr. Wily stage, you then faced 4 robots from Mega Man 4, Dustman, Diveman, Drillman, and Skullman. You then squared off against a 9th robot named Punk, who was the only original boss character in the game. With Punk defeated and his sub-weapon added to Mega Man's arsenal, you would then enter the game's final stage and face Dr. Wily himself. After sidelining Mega Man 2, developer Minakuchi Engineering has returned with a vengeance. And I mean that literally, these guys seem pissed. And I'm convinced that they are using Mega Man 3 to punish us for whatever wrongdoing they believe we have committed. Every criticism I made about Dr. Wily's Revenge applies to Mega Man 3, possibly even to a stronger degree. The screen is still too small, and the NES sprites are still a bit too crowded on the tiny Game Boy screen. There are more ridiculously precise jumps to make, more traps that require almost pixel-perfect gameplay, and what certainly seems to be the highest density of instant death traps that we've seen in a Mega Man game since, well, probably ever. Dustman stage is probably the best example of the unflinching cruelty of Mega Man 3's design. The level opens up with several jumps over bottomless pits with those annoying enemies that shoot up to knock you out of the air. Shortly after that, as you are descending through a number of vertically oriented screens, you reach this screen where you had to drop through an opening in the center of the room. What's impossible to know unless you played through the level before is that waiting for you in the next screen is a giant robot that leaps at you as soon as you drop into the room. You have to know in advance to pull hard to the right to avoid taking damage. Then there's the tight jumps across pits and spikes where it's all too easy to hit your head on the low-hanging ceilings and fall to your death. And of course there's this room, where the safest way over the spikes is to take intentional damage and run across using your invincibility period. And the game knows this is a dick move, that's why it gives you a large health refill immediately afterwards. And assuming you made it through this gauntlet, the level wraps up by forcing you to slide directly into the path of one of those patrolling shield enemies. Granted, not all of Mega Man 3's stages are as extreme as Dustman's stage, but the vindictive nature of this game's stage design is present to some degree in almost every other level in the game. And then there's the fight with Punk, who is what Metal Man would probably look like if he got mutated by that ooze from Ninja Turtles 2. Punk has a very simple attack pattern. He jumps around at the far side of the room throwing saw blades at you, which aren't terribly hard to avoid, but then he turns into a giant saw blade himself and zips across the room. You have to either jump or slide to avoid him, depending on whether he crosses the room high or low, and he doesn't telegraph what height he's going to use. Due to the small size of the room and the speed he moves at, successfully avoiding him pretty much comes down to luck rather than reflexes, and he will completely take you out in just 3 hits. So it's a good idea to come into this battle with a full stock of E-Tanks. Now you might think that all this would make me absolutely hate this game, but to be honest, I've always loved Mega Man 3, and it's not because I appreciated the extra challenge, because I assure you, I did not. What I did appreciate was what a massive improvement it was over the first 2 games. In fact, in some ways, the Game Boy version of Mega Man 3 even improves on the original NES game. Snake Man's stage opens up with these animated palm trees in the background. I love that. And Gemini Man's stage has animated foreground elements. Granted, these are sometimes a bit distracting and probably don't do much to help with the game's slowdown, but damned if they don't look pretty cool. And gone are the hokey, super deformed character sprites from Mega Man 2. The enemies in this game appear more or less exactly as they did in the original NES games. A few of the larger enemy sprites have been shrunken down a bit, but in a very clean way compared to the clumsily abbreviated look from Mega Man 2. In short, Mega Man 3 is, from top to bottom, an incredibly sharp-looking game. Now, the NES versions of Mega Man 3 and 4 has some of the best music in the series, and this music has made a very clean transition to the Game Boy. The music in this game is awesome, with excellent renditions of those classic NES themes, and a handful of original tracks too, including an absolute banger of a Dr. Wily theme. As a kid, I had a particular attachment to the NES versions of Mega Man 3 and 4, and my fondness for Mega Man 3 might have something to do with how well it represented those games. Also, my relief that Capcom seemed to have turned the corner on whatever the hell happened with Mega Man 2 might have also supercharged my opinion of Mega Man 3. And even as a kid, I recognized that there was actual value in not being able to finish a game on the first day you received it, which is likely one of the few positives that I was able to take from my experience with Mega Man 2. But regardless of my reasoning, Mega Man 3 was my favorite game in the Game Boy Mega Man series as a kid. And even though I still find it overly punishing and more than a little unfair, I still have something of a soft spot for it as an adult. Mega Man 4 arrived in the US in December of 1993, just a few months before the 6th installment of the console series was released on the NES. Despite the release dates of these games being separated by 3 months, Nintendo Power would provide a full spread for both games in the same issue, while simultaneously reminding readers that the real Mega Man game they were interested in was available for the Super Nintendo. Mega Man 4 and 6 may have suffered from being extremely late releases on two systems that were rapidly falling out of fashion, but in my opinion, they both benefited by being developed, presumably, in such close proximity to Mega Man X. Mega Man X revitalized the now bog-standard Mega Man formula not only in terms of graphics and music, but also with its gameplay. Optional character upgrades, secret items and areas, and increased utility of Mega Man sub-weapons encouraged exploration and offered a deeper and potentially more rewarding experience than players had seen in any Mega Man game up to this point. And it seemed that the other development teams were paying attention, as traces of these gameplay improvements would bleed into the development of Mega Man 4 and 6. And the result was a pair of games that, in my opinion at least, were the overall best games in their respective series. Mega Man 4 follows the same formula established by the previous games in the Game Boy series, first pitting you against 4 robots from one of the NES games, Toadman, Brightman, Pharaohman, and Ringman from Mega Man 4, and then following a short Dr. Wily stage, you're presented with 4 robots from the next game in the NES series, Stone Man, Charge Man, Crystal Man, and Napalm Man from Mega Man 5. And with all 8 robots defeated, Mega Man is confronted by a 9th robot, who ultimately provides Mega Man with the final sub-weapon that you'll use to take down Dr. Wily in the final stage. The game also introduces Dr. Light's item shop and a currency system. P-chips can be collected during the main stages and used to purchase things like extra lives and E-tanks. This also marks the first appearance of the energy balancer, which automatically fills the sub-weapon with the lowest energy level when you pick up a weapon energy pellet. The energy balancer and the item shop mechanic would both become regular features in future Mega Man games. Mega Man's charge shot has also been slightly modified. Unleashing a fully powered up charge shot will actually kick Mega Man back a bit. Not much, but just enough to make you think twice before using it on narrow platforms. Now, the charge shot was a source of contention for some players when it originally appeared in the NES series, as it actively undercut the central gameplay mechanic that defined the entire series by diminishing the importance of the various sub-weapons. Adding just a slight element of danger to the charge shot doesn't completely mitigate how overpowered it is, but as a long-time and very vocal critic of the charge shot mechanic, I can appreciate Mega Man 4's tiny step towards restoring a bit of balance. The gameplay itself has been rebalanced as well. Although Mega Man 4 definitely is not without challenge, the difficulty has been noticeably scaled back from what we saw in Mega Man 3. Mega Man 4 is the third game in the series developed by Minakuchi Engineering, and by this point I think it's safe to say that they had perfected developing Mega Man games for the Game Boy. The graphics and music are of course excellent as always, but there's an extra layer of polish overall that in many ways eclipsed the work that Capcom themselves had done in the original series. Although the game reuses many assets and ideas from its NES counterparts, Mega Man 4 builds upon established mechanics in clever and unexpected ways, and sprinkles in a handful of original ideas as well. Ringman's sub-weapon can now be used to grab items, like the Boomerang Cutter did in Mega Man X. Crystal Man's stage features branching paths and several heart-racing sequences through telescoping platforms that either drop away under your feet or crush you from above. Napalm Man's stage introduces flames that need to be extinguished with a range shot, and takes the drill machine that only appeared in a single hallway on the NES, and turns it into a reoccurring platform mechanic that takes you through the last half of the stage. And that's to say nothing of the impressive animated cutscenes that appear at various points throughout the game. which is a level of presentation that has been rarely seen in the Mega Man series, before or since. All this extra flourish and polish comes at a cost, however. One thing you're going to be seeing a lot in Mega Man 4 is the same room cut and pasted several times throughout each level. Now this is obviously an oversimplification, but the idea as I understand it is that once a room has been designed, it can then be used multiple times without requiring additional memory from the cartridge. This is a cheap way to make stages longer than the cartridge would technically allow, and this trick is used liberally throughout Mega Man 4. I understand why this was done, but I wish it wasn't done quite as much as it was. I'd rather a stage be a little bit shorter than have to run or climb through the same set of screens 2 or 3 times during the same level. However, this doesn't really detract from the game as a whole. For the most part, Mega Man 4 is the perfect realization of how great a Mega Man game on the Game Boy could be, and in some ways even shows how much better other Mega Man games should have been. Mega Man 5 is the final game in the Game Boy Mega Man series, bringing a close to the longest running series in the entire Game Boy library. Now, I've never really thought of Mega Man's Game Boy games as really being part of the official storyline from the NES series, probably because these games always felt like a reaction to the NES series, and despite some solid efforts, didn't have an especially strong identity of their own. This was more of a series of side stories, a Mega Man Gaiden, if you will. This all changed with Mega Man 5. Released in the US in September of 1994, Mega Man 5 appeared during something of a transitional period in the Mega Man series. Earlier that year had seen the release of Mega Man 6, which was the last Mega Man game released on the NES. Around that same time, the Super Nintendo had gotten Mega Man X, the debut entry to the first of Mega Man's many spin-off series. And for additional perspective, just a few months after Mega Man 5 came out, the Sony PlayStation would be released in Japan. Mega Man 5 would mark the end of an era, the final Mega Man game released on an 8-bit Nintendo console, and it was also one of the last Game Boy games that I would ever purchase back in the day, before I sold my entire Game Boy collection, including minty complete in-box copies of the games shown here on the screen, for a measly $75. Even though I had lost most of my interest for the Game Boy at that time, I was still willing to come back to it for one more round with Mega Man. Besides, this was a game that I was especially interested in. The first 3 Mega Man games had been based on the first 4 games in the NES series, all of which I was familiar with to some degree. Mega Man 4, however, had featured 4 robots from the 5th NES game, which at that point I had never played. Therefore, it could logically be deduced that Mega Man 5 on the Game Boy would feature the remaining 4 bosses from Mega Man 5, and then 4 bosses from Mega Man 6. This would make Mega Man 5 the first game in the Game Boy series to feature bosses that were totally unknown to me. And I was right, but not in the way I expected. Mega Man 5 features 8 completely original robot bosses, stages, and music, making this game the first and only game in the Game Boy series not to use existing assets from the NES series. In terms of game design, Mega Man 5 continues the escalation in quality we've seen in the series up to this point. Unburdened by any connection to characters and stages from the NES series, Minakuchi Engineering was free to flex their creative muscles, and the result was 8 imaginatively crafted stages that were filled with fresh ideas, as well as new spins on familiar mechanics. The impressive animated cutscenes from Mega Man 4 are unfortunately nowhere to be found here, but that extra space was used to create long and diverse stages without the gratuitous cutting and pasting that Mega Man 4 had relied on. The soundtrack is also pretty solid. Obviously there's nothing here that's going to compare to the classic tunes from the NES series, but honestly if you like the music from the 3rd and 4th games in the Game Boy series, you're probably going to like this music too. A new mechanic is the Mega Arm, which pretty much functions just like the standard power shot, except Mega Man is actually shooting out his hand to punch enemies, which to be honest I think looks pretty silly. But by collecting P-chips, you can purchase upgrades for the Mega Arm so it's able to strike enemies multiple times with a single shot, or grab items from a distance. A new support character has also been added, a robot cat named Tango, who I honestly haven't really found a use for. I'm not sure why he's in the game. But I guess the real stars of the show are the 8 new boss characters. Instead of carrying on the established formula of attribute men from the previous games, the bosses in Mega Man 5 are called star droids and are based on the planets in the solar system: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, which at that time was still considered a planet. Earth is represented as the robot Terra, who fills the role of the 9th big robot in the game, like Anchor, Quint, Punk, and Ballade from the previous games. Honestly, these star droids are at the heart of every issue I have with Mega Man 5. And it's not because they're different from what I'm used to and I don't like change, although that's certainly part of it. I have a laundry list of mostly minor grievances that range from the ambiguity of their strengths and weaknesses to how inconsistently the characters and or their stages represent the planets they're named after. But there's no sense in belaboring the point, because it all boils down to the fact that these new characters were simply not utilized as well as they should have been. I think ultimately the Star Droids probably fell victim to a rushed development schedule, and I have a crazy feeling that they were actually a late addition to the game. I think it's possible that when Capcom and Minakuchi Engineering first started working on Mega Man 5, they were still planning to use characters from the NES games. We know that had they followed the format from the previous 4 Game Boy titles, this game would have opened up with Gravity Man, Wave Man, Star Man, and Gyro Man. And as it happens, this game has a Gravity Man stage, and a Wave Man stage, and what could have certainly passed for a Star Man stage. And if I squint really hard, I can easily imagine that what was originally planned to be Gyro Man stage was reworked to create this weird bubble stage. I would not be surprised to learn that the idea for the Star Droids was something they came up with well after the development of the stages was underway. And without the time to fully integrate them into the game, they simply plugged these new characters into whatever stages they seemed to fit with best. That would certainly explain the weird disconnect between many of these characters and their stages. But I don't know, it's just a theory. Now keep in mind that this isn't necessarily something I'm holding against the game, but this is why I don't find the Star Droids to be a satisfying replacement for the Robot Masters from the other games, where each boss's power, and to a lesser degree their weakness, is clearly stated in their name. And in a prolific series like Mega Man, where the primary difference from one game to the next is the selection of Robot Masters, I don't think anyone plays these games for the Dr. Wily stages. This means that between two games that are otherwise almost equal in quality, the game that features bosses that don't work as well will ultimately fall below the game where the bosses did. Though the Star Droids didn't click for me as well as I would have liked, the rest of the game, outside of kind of a weak Dr. Wily stage, was ultimately so well designed that I'm willing to concede that Mega Man 5 is overall the best game in the entire Mega Man Game Boy series, although my personal favorite is still Mega Man 4. Now, since this is the last time I'll be talking at length about Mega Man's Game Boy games in this series, I might as well say a few words about where the series went from here. Minakuchi Engineering would continue working with Capcom on other games in the Mega Man series, specifically the Wily Wars on the Sega Genesis and Mega Man X3 on the Super Nintendo. The 5 Mega Man Game Boy games would stay exclusive to the original Game Boy for about 20 years, although a compilation was planned for the Game Boy Advance that would be released alongside the anniversary collections for the GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. This allegedly would have included colorized versions of all 5 games in the series, as well as a number of unspecified extras. Unfortunately, the game was cancelled, and the only proper Mega Man game we got on the Game Boy Advance was a bastardized port of Rockman Forte. The games were released as digital downloads for the 3DS, which at that time was the easiest and cheapest way to play these games outside of emulation, as even when collecting Game Boy games was still relatively inexpensive, Mega Man's games generally all went for premium prices, especially the 4th and 5th games. Anchor, Punk, and Ballade, the Mega Man killers from the 1st, 3rd, and 4th games respectively, appeared in special stages in Mega Man 10. And even more recently, all 5 games were added to the Switch's online Game Boy library. So if you have any interest at all in playing these games, you definitely still have a few options to do so. And lastly, and I should warn you this is purely speculative, there's some very scant evidence that Mega Man's adventures on the Game Boy had some influence over the console games that came afterwards, or at least a few of them. Mega Man 7, which came out about a year after Mega Man 5, shared a suspicious number of similarities to the Game Boy games. For one thing, the character-to-screen proportions are about the same here as they were on the Game Boy. Comparing this sprite to the Mega Man X sprite, it's pretty clear that they could have made Mega Man smaller, but they specifically designed him to be larger, which was an interesting choice. Mega Man 7 also continued the item shop that originally appeared in Mega Man 4, and it rolled out the 8 robot bosses in 2 sets of 4, just as all the Game Boy games did. And finally, it even included a Mega Man killer robot, along the lines of Enker, Quint, Punk, and Ballade. Bass. Mega Man 8 and Rockman Forte would also use many of these features, and even though the series more or less returned to its roots in Mega Man 9, the item shop has been a regular feature all the way up to Mega Man 11, which is, as of this video, currently the last official game to be released in the core Mega Man series. If you made it this far, allow me to formally welcome you to the end of the video. If you liked this video and want to see more, there are many more Game Boy focused videos on my channel, just like this one. If you have a favorite Game Boy game or game series, feel free to mention it in the comment section below. And I'll see you next time on the good, the bad, and the Game Boy.